Thank you, everybody. I honestly did not expect this penultimate session to be so full, and I'm very pleased and flattered that you're here. So I hope it'll be interesting, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I'm Deirdre Strawn, and this is Marketing Your Tech Talent. If you're wondering, am I in the right room? Which tech talent are we talking about, and who's doing the marketing? If you do any of these things in the tech industry, and probably others that I've forgotten to put on the list, then you do have technical talent, and I am talking to you. I assume that you already know what your own technical talents are and how they're developing. This talk is about why and how you should market your talents and yourself. We need to start with a little bit of historical context. I have been in this industry for quite a long time. So this is Byte magazine in 1993. That is what a very typical piece of technology marketing looked like in those days. Of course, I chose Sun for sentimental reasons, even though back in those days I myself did not know what Sun Microsystems was. As you can see, in those days, technology marketing, as practiced by marketing professionals, looked like any other marketing. This could have been Tide soap detergent in a women's magazine. It was all glossy brochures, magazine ads, product data sheets, the kinds of things that everybody else was doing in every other industry. It was all written by professional marketers in that neutral corporate tone of voice. It was aimed at corporate decision makers. CTOs barely existed as a concept then, but CEOs and so forth. Or it was aimed at the other end of the spectrum at consumers of things like games and home software and so forth on the early PCs. Neither category was actually expected to know much about the underpinning technology. So the marketing accordingly was high level, jargony. Again, it looked like anything else. Anybody could have written this. The other important thing about marketing 20 years ago was that it was a one-way street. In order to communicate to the world about your product, you had to have money. You had to be able to afford print ads, magazine ads, newspapers, TV, radio, that kind of thing. Companies could communicate out in a very one-to-many fashion because they could afford mass media. Customers could not communicate back really in any effective way. The most you could do was call a consumer hotline at Procter & Gamble and say, my dishwashing powder has caked, or maybe send them a nasty letter. Now, in 1993, already the internet was about to change this equation, but it took a long time for companies to understand this. So for years after 1993, marketing remained a very one-to-many activity. In fact, early websites were called brochureware because people just took their existing glossy brochures and flyers and data sheets and shoved them on the web. So the only difference was you could read it electronically instead of picking up at a flyer at a conference and carrying it around in a bag. The other important point is that the tone and style of the communications did not change at all. It was still written by marketers, written for C-level or consumers. There was really not very much of a technical voice there. The concurrent to that was that technology appeared to be produced by faceless companies. There were some people back there somewhere writing code and creating hardware, but none of us knew who they were. There were a few famous faces, of course. Jobs and Wozniak and Bill Gates were already getting to be famous, and they were used as the faces of their companies, but nobody else was known. So you may wonder why that was. So I'll tell you a little personal anecdote. So in the early 90s, I worked for an Italian startup because I happened to be living in Italy, which made consumer CD recording software, a suite called Easy CD. We moved the company to the US, and the company eventually in 95 was bought by an American hardware company called Adaptec. Now, it's my job. I had already for several years been working with the developers on UI. I was doing all the documentation, and I had started to play around with talking to customers online. In those days, I was using CompuServe forums and the Usenet, and then I started a mailing list. So ironically, I became famous as one of the faces of CDR, in that restricted world. Customers knew who I was. They didn't know who the devs were. It's like the guys who were actually creating the products that they used and were doing all these cool things with, they had no idea who these people were. And I kind of felt that was unfair. Here I'm the one getting famous. Yeah, I did write a book, but again, I'm not the one who's actually producing all this wonderful code that does these great things. I also, at the same time, was writing a lot of Adaptec's web content, all the stuff about CDR, which was getting a lot of the traffic. And I was constantly looking for new things to write about because I had already instinctively grasped this concept that you have to keep the content coming. You can't just put a brochure out there and expect people to keep coming back and reading. So I had this great idea. Combine these two things I was concerned about. Let's do bios of the engineers. It's like we had a bunch of Italians. They've had interesting lives. And here's the Americans we added. I made the mistake of mentioning this idea to one of the Adaptec execs and was shut down very, very hard before it ever started. I was completely mystified. Why would you not want me to do that? I was ordered, never release the name of any engineer in any public forum because we don't want them to be hired away. In other words, we actively discourage our engineers from being known, let alone famous, because somebody else might come and poach them. Somebody else in those days often meant Microsoft. This was very typical company behavior at the time, and it had been for years. Developers were a critical asset. Companies knew that. And companies thought the best way to protect that asset was to lock it in the basement, where no one could find it. Now, developers rebelled against this. And one way they did so was to put Easter eggs in their software. So this is the first known software Easter egg, which was placed in the Atari Adventure game in 1979 by game designer Warren Robinette. This image is out on Wikipedia, and the story is told there. And some of you may remember, you would find out what the shortcuts were where you could go and open up the Easter egg and see the names of the developers. But that was the only way they had of getting their names out there early on. So I'm going to be talking about several different threads, and eventually they do all come together. By 1999, a few people, notably the 4 authors of the Clue Train Manifesto, began to realize that the internet was causing the world to change. It was very different from all other forms of communication because it offered equal access to everybody. We could all get out on the internet and post something. And it offered the possibility of an immediate response. I was out there on the forums, on the Usenet and so on, and I was representing my company and I was answering. Now, not many companies were doing that. In fact, I heard about the Clue Train Manifesto because somebody wrote to me and said, I think you're a great example of what these guys are talking about in this book. So I went and read the book. It's like, yeah, I'm doing that, and now I understand why I'm doing it. So individuals were finding ways to use the internet to have a conversation about products, about technology, about life, about politics, about anything. Customers were becoming less and less interested in being talked at, and especially less interested in being talked at with the typical corporate weasel words. They wanted to have open and honest conversations with the people who were creating the products that they were using. So now we jump 15 years, and a whole lot of things have changed. This was a book that was published last year by Stephen O'Grady, and it is available quite cheaply on Kindle and so on. So 3 more critical elements have come into play. The internet had made it possible for customers to talk back to companies. Another trend back in the mid-90s was people would put up domains, fuck you, company X. And companies at first were panicking. How do we counter that? And it took a long time for companies to realize that you couldn't, for example, take legal action to shut those things down. So companies were against their will being dragged into having equal conversations with their customers. So the internet made it possible for customers to talk back. The smarter companies, the ones who had started to jump on the Clue train, were learning how to listen. Not every company has learned this even today, but it's a lot better than it was. In the meantime, the open source software movement had begun and began to show us entirely new ways of doing the software business and now even the hardware business. Then along came the cloud. The cloud means that you can run an online business without having to buy your own servers. Now, if you remember back to the dot-com boom, Sun Microsystems was very, very wealthy because they were selling the backbones of the dot-com boom. Nowadays, even if Sun still existed, it would be nowhere because you as developers can go out on the cloud and start your own company and not pay for all that stuff and not have to run it. These 3 factors make starting your own tech companies a hell of a lot cheaper than it was during the last boom. And now seed stage financing is available to cover what few expenses you have. So all of this, as O'Grady points out in this book, has combined to make developers and other technical people the new kingmakers, as he put it. It is the technical people who are making the buying decisions, and therefore companies have to talk to the technical people. Talk with them, not at them. We need to have these conversations with people who are making technical decisions, and those people are no longer necessarily the CTOs and CIOs of large companies. Now, this is pretty obvious to those of us who are doing the technical work, that we're techies. We know that we don't like being talked to in traditional marketing ways. We don't like the way marketing is done to us. We tend to ignore brochureware websites and fluffy jargon, and we want to go and talk to other technical people. We know that we're the best people to have that conversation, both giving and receiving. In a lot of companies, having that conversation, a direct open conversation between techie to techie, can be very hard to do, partly because there is still a layer of traditional marketing in there. For some reason, every single company at some point feels, we've gotten to X size, we have to hire a marketing department. The problem is technical people despise marketing departments. They don't understand what marketers do, and often marketers don't understand the technology they're trying to market, so they're still out there trying to make brochures and data sheets without even realizing that this is not what reaches the customers today. So we don't understand and appreciate each other's work. A lot of times we don't even like each other very much as people. Like, we're completely opposite in character and temperament. And I'm sure all of you can think of examples you have personally experienced of where this has caused problems. In startups, in larger companies, personally I believe that one of the reasons Sun Microsystems failed was the lack of communication between engineering and marketing. Engineering was off making things, throw it over the wall, it's okay, your problem to sell it, off you go. And marketing would, engineering's out of control, what do we do? Another sidetrack, which again, this will all start to make sense. In Hollywood, the way things have been working ever since the big old studio system has fallen apart, for decades now, the model for making films, for the physical production and post-production of films, is that almost everybody involved is a freelancer. You come together, you do all the different bits of making a film in front of the camera, behind the camera, post-production, distribution, marketing, advertising, and so on. You bring together a team for the duration of a project. Once that project is done, the film is released, everybody goes off and does another project. Production teams are hired for specific skills, like they know how to use a particular editing suite, a particular sound editor, particular visual effects. There are some exceptions, like the big animation houses, where they're developing their own tools, and therefore they tend to keep those people in-house. But a lot of the films you see, all those teams come together ad hoc. So they come together, they work for several years on a project, and then they all disperse to other projects. And you can think of what's happening in tech today as a very similar model. People come together for a few years, they do a startup based around some idea, they hire in other people based on, okay, we need a guy who does databases, we need a person who does UI, we need a person to do documentation, we need a person to run a community. Bring it all together. IPO is not really as much of a thing these days as it was in the previous dot-com boom. So often nowadays the goal is to sell or to be acqui-hired to some larger company. So it's very similar to a film project. You build it up for a few years, you hand it off, it's done. You make some money, you go on to the next thing. And if you'll notice, even in acqui-hire scenarios, often the top talents that you're acqui-hired for don't end up actually staying with the acquiring company for much longer than their contracts require. So I think this is a very good analogy with how films are made nowadays. But we're missing a very critical part of the Hollywood equation. The film industry has very well-established methods for identifying, categorizing, and promoting talent. We don't have IMDb. We don't have agents out saying, oh, you're Brad Pitt, your next film should be a rom-com. Or, you're Angelina Jolie, your next film should be an action-adventure. And here's how, and I'm going to help you negotiate a salary, and I'm going to take 15% of it. We don't have all that. We're still in the early days of the tech industry and the talents that we are and have. As talents, we haven't been out of the basement for very long. What this all adds up to is that ultimately, at this phase in technology, you are responsible for your career. And part of that responsibility is that you have to market yourself. I know that marketing is not a skill that comes easily to most people in this category, but in the end, no one can market you as well as you can. You understand your talents, you understand your skills, you know who you've worked with, you know deep technologies that even a talent agent really probably can't understand as well as you can. So whether you like it or not, you need to learn to market yourself for the good of your own career. And this will also be good for the companies that you end up working for, as I will go on to explain. So this is the most important message I can give you today. You need to do this. I'm especially talking to the many of us who are uncomfortable talking about our own accomplishments. Women in particular, we have reasons to be wary about tooting our own horns because we know from both experience and from research recently that that can backfire on us. There's a whole minefield there for women. But it can be difficult for all of us. We all really, we are in technology because we love technology, we want to think about technology, and all this marketing stuff is a distraction, unfortunately, but it's a necessary distraction. We would like to believe if we build it and it's good, they will come. Or if we're good at what we do, that will be recognized and we get to do more of it. None of that is automatically true. So if you want your technology and your career to thrive in the real world, you need to learn how to market yourself and what you do. Then as you move from project to project and company to company, you will bring your own fame with you. And that will contribute to the success of whatever project and company you're involved in. So we've talked about why, and now we'll get into how. So before you start any project, it's helpful to think about exactly what you're trying to accomplish. So in this case, marketing yourself, you are trying to establish your own reputation. You're trying to get even better at what you love to do. Now, strangely enough, once you do start talking about what you do, you tend to get better at it. Partly because it's like, okay, well, I've done this and this and this. Logically, I should also be doing this. So I'm going to go out and learn how to do that. But also you start to get feedback. I started a few years ago writing up some of my notes on how do I do video streaming, how do I get videos up on, even pre-YouTube. I started using video to film technology talks, and other people wanted to know how they could do that. And I wanted to be helpful, so I published blog posts about what I do and how I do it. And then people would write back to me and say, hey, that's really great, it's really useful, I used it at so-and-so conference. And that, of course, made me feel good, so then I wanted to do more of it. And, I've done training, and I've started to, this is my biggest conference to date, so thank you all for being here. So you get feedback, you get motivated, and actually the process of marketing yourself inspires you to be a better product, in a sense. And it does all help your company. Among other things, when you start writing about what you do, or filming about it, or doing screencasts or whatever, you are actually producing technical content about what you do, and that is something I can guarantee you your company desperately needs. Every single technical company needs lots and lots of content. Documentation, tutorials, code snippets, how-tos. They need that stuff, and you know very well that you are going to produce it much better than the marketing department can. So all of this is going to be helping your company, and it all wraps up into a bundle of showing the rest of the world that awesomeness thrives where you are. And that helps your company because other people want to come and be involved in awesomeness. So obviously, I'm sure we are all familiar with most or all of these. How many of you are doing any of these already? Like you have a Twitter account, you're speaking at conferences, you're doing a blog, you're speaking at meetups, you're a member of a community, open source community or other technology community. So nowadays, thanks to the internet, but not only, also thanks to, for example, cheaper electronics, we all have the power of the printing press. Any of us can get out there and have a blog. Any of us can put a video on YouTube. Each of these tools has different uses. This is not a complete list, and of course there's new ones coming along all the time. But you should already be using one or more of these, and probably already are. Blogging is something, obviously, I could do a full-day workshop about. I'm sure many of you already have done blogging, are doing it. I will say in this context, blogging is still really the best way to talk about technology because you can share complex concepts, people can more easily digest them in text, and you can share code and screen output and so on in ways that you simply can't do as effectively in any other medium. Also, from the point of view of a company that's trying to get attention, search engines are everything. Text is highly searchable, keyword rich. So, whatever field and specific niche you're trying to get attention for, the more text is out there, the more search engine traffic you're going to get. And blogging nowadays is very easy. I'm sure most of us are capable, even I am capable of installing WordPress and keeping it more or less running, except for that time I got hacked by Russians. Another thing that people don't tend to think is as easy is video. I have at this point done hundreds of technical videos. Many times it's a bunch of engineers sitting in a room talking. Other times it's situations like this. I actually pirated video last year of Brendan Gregg speaking because it wasn't being filmed by OSCON. And that is out on YouTube now. So getting yourself onto video is becoming a more and more important part of your personal portfolio, partly because if you're going to apply to speak at a conference like this one, it helps the conference organizers to know that you can get up and talk credibly in front of an audience if they can see an example of you already doing it. It's also helpful when you're perhaps about to be hired by a startup. They might like to know that you're capable of getting up in front of investors and customers and speaking credibly about what you're doing. So having that already out there on video means there's one less question mark for somebody to wonder about, is this person actually capable? It's also good for potentially somebody who's thinking about hiring you as a teammate. Is this somebody whose body language, whose way of communicating I'm comfortable with? Now, I realize there are a lot of caveats there about biases in people's minds, people liking to hire people who sort of look and feel like them, and that's why we end up with teams that look very homogeneous. So there are pitfalls to that. No easy answers there, but that is a much larger question for another time. One thing I will say about video is that the quality, that pushback you will get from traditional marketing departments is, oh, if it's not really slick, it won't reflect well on the company. We can't have that out there. It's not true. It just has to be decent quality. It has to be good enough audio that people are comfortable listening to it. If you get something that's got a lot of echo or hiss and is just nasty to listen to, then people will turn it off. But I mean, this was a pretty muddy video. I was in a conference room with, had sunlight, but that was about it. So, but it came out perfectly acceptable. If you're just getting started and you haven't yet had a chance to speak in a situation like this where you are getting filmed by professionals, like you're going to go speak at a local meetup, get a friend to come along and film it on a smartphone. As I said, the video I did of Brendan speaking in this room last year at this time was entirely done on my iPhone. And I put it out on YouTube, and it's fine. One caveat here is webinars, which is the format where you're talking and people can see slides and maybe see what you're doing on your screen, but they can't actually see your face. I don't know why marketers are really fond of this. I think partly because they know how to set it up and control it, and they can get, there's a lot of established tools that will let them find out who dialed in when and when they dialed out and so on. Try to resist this because it's really, really boring for your audience. Always think from the audience's point of view, is this something I would enjoy sitting through? The answer is probably no. Don't do it. Again, public speaking. Get out there on the speaker circuit as soon as you can. Some of you may have already spoken at OSCON this week and don't need this advice, but some of you may still be getting started or wondering how to. If you haven't done much public speaking yet, you can ease into it. You can do internal talks with your internal teams. You can start offering brown bags at your company. You can do local meetups. You can do community group meetups and work up to it. All of these give you opportunities to hone your speaking skills and start to get noticed by larger and larger audiences. Now, the boost to your career here should be pretty obvious, but it's also good for your company. Now, I don't mean that you should come to OSCON and give a sales pitch for a product, because we all have had that done to us, usually not at OSCON, but at other conferences, and we know how much we hate that. But just getting out there and establishing that you yourself are a thought leader in a particular technology area, that your company is doing interesting things in a particular technology, all of that demonstrates leadership, demonstrates that your company has competence in that area. So it's always useful. Again, we're all here at OSCON. I'm assuming I don't have to tell you folks. that open source is valuable and is part of your reputation. You know, put some code out there and let people see what you can actually do if you're a coder. And if you're not a coder, put a blog post out there talking about other things you do. I have never been a coder, so what I do is text and video. Being an active member of a relevant community. Really, this should be part of everybody's job description in every technical position in every company. Again, we're at OSCON. I probably don't need to say this too much. If you really have a lot of material, particularly concentrated in one easily concentratable field, think about whether you might have something that you could get published in a technical journal, of which one of the very few examples in computing is Communications of the ACM, or even write a book. You know, people tend to think that writing a book might be a hard thing to do. Actually, publishers are dying for new material. They would love to hear from you. However, and also your company will probably love to have a published author on staff. They will probably not love it so much during the period in which you are doing the writing, because it is a lot of work. And also, do not ever become a writer for the money. I worked with Brendan Gregg on his last 2 books, and I know that each of them took at least 2,000 hours of his time. And he was doing them mostly nights and weekends, and that's not counting the many hundreds of hours I spent editing them. And the money is just not there. But it is certainly, the fame is there. If you write a good book, it will be around for years. It will be remembered for years. You know, Adrian Cockcroft, who was until earlier this year was the head of architecture at Netflix, part of the reason he became famous is that he wrote one of the very early books on performance. And it was a standard, still is a standard text in the industry for many years. It wasn't even that big a book. But that helped him to establish his reputation, so he went on to Netflix, has spoken at lots and lots of conferences, and now he's gone on to be an advisor to VCs about cloud and all kinds of things. The opposite end of the word count spectrum, we have Twitter. Because Twitter is so constrained and so chopped up, it is not a good place for complex conversations, whether we're talking about politics or technology. But it is a great way for building and maintaining relationships. Like, there's a bunch of people I met just this OSCON whom I had never actually met face-to-face, but I've known them for years on Twitter, and just their style, their photograph is familiar to me, and I just walked up to those people and gave them hugs. It's like I felt like I had known them well for many years, and in a sense I have. So it's great for relationships. It's also great for steering people to content, to a blog post, to a video, whatever, and it doesn't have to be just your own content. In fact, content curation is a very valuable service. You, as an expert in a particular field, you're out reading other people's stuff as well. You tweet about that and you say, hey, here's a useful article about this topic. Other people, start to realize, yes, this person does share valuable stuff and not rubbish, and they're not sharing marketing crap from their company. So, whatever this person tweets is probably something I do actually want to go and read. And that's a valuable service. But you can't create all the content in the world yourself, obviously. So help people find other content that is good and that makes your point. Marketers and executives are still very fond of the concept of white papers, possibly because they like to put them behind a login so they can demand your email before you get to download it and read it. As tech people, we have become very suspicious of this, partly because of this, give me your email, but also because white papers have the reputation now of being full of fluff and written by marketers rather than techies. The white papers used to be great. Nowadays, they may still be great, but a lot of techies don't believe it and won't even bother. So if you have good technical content that you want to share with the world, just put it on a blog. Don't try to put a login around it. If you really want to, you can duplicate it as a white paper and let the marketers have it. And they will be happy because they'll go and get the executives to give up their emails in order to get that paper, whereas the techies will be reading your blog. So just a few general guidelines that apply to just about any medium you may be using. First of all, tone. Going back to that advertisement from 1993, as I said, it was very neutral, it was very corporate, faceless. Nowadays, with blogging and Twitter and so on, we expect people to have a real human voice, and we respond to that. If you tried to talk in that marketing tone, people wouldn't like it. So speak the way you would speak to your friends. because that's how you do talk to your friends. You're talking to your peers. You're starting a conversation. You're not selling. However, it doesn't mean that you should be sloppy. Personally, I don't really care whether you use swear words or not, but it's a taste thing. But do spell them correctly. And get your grammar right, because sloppy writing, consciously or unconsciously, it says to the reader, I don't care enough to write this well, and therefore they start to wonder whether you care enough to have thought it through well. So just do the basics. If you are not comfortable with your writing skills, and even if you are, it's always a good idea to have at least one other pair of eyes on it to say, well, here's a little grammar mistake. I'm not quite sure. I don't follow your thinking here. It always helps to kind of have a logging buddy to look things over for a minute before you publish it. So getting started in all this may seem very intimidating. You see people out there, writing and making videos and tweeting up a storm, and you think, well, I don't have that much to say. How could I possibly keep it up? There's a good chance that you actually already have created material that will be valuable, and you just don't know it. It's like if you are somebody who writes an extremely good report in a bug database about, when you found the bug and or how you solved it, that actually might be very good material for a public blog post that the rest of the world would benefit from. What were the nitty-gritties of this thing? How did I troubleshoot it? How did I get down to the root cause, and how did it get fixed? There may be internal or external email threads from groups about, like, for example, I used to listen in on the email groups about ZFS and dtrace and so on. A lot of the times I was like, would you guys please take this big long email and put it in a blog post, because no one's ever going to find it in that mail. So you may have already written something. Think about that. In my, back when I was doing customer support online, my rule of thumb was if I had to answer a question, the same question 3 times, it was time to make a web page about it, because obviously it was an FAQ, and that's why FAQ pages exist. So as you start putting more and more time into this, you and or your colleagues may wonder, well, what good is this doing the company? You're out here doing all this self-aggrandizing. Are you just out for your own good, or is this actually doing any good for the rest of us? Well, technology does need marketing. Building it is not enough to get people to come to it. And good technical content is the very best form of technology marketing these days. And as I said before, the people who actually create the technology are the best people to communicate about it. You will likely do this better than your marketing department can. And again, you're out there, you're proving technical competence, you're showing people what you know, how things are done at your company, what great things you do together, and you then thereby are attracting other great people to come and work with you. As we all know, talent wars, there's a huge crying need. Every company is looking desperately for good tech talent. I can guarantee you that most of the time, companies do not find their best tech talent by recruiter emails through LinkedIn. And superstars attract attention. This was a picture I took in Hyderabad, India, at the very last Sun Tech Days, which at that, within days of this had already been rebranded Oracle. This is James Gosling, the father of Java, who very shortly after that left Oracle. You go back to the holiday, this is literally a billboard, and what in India is called a hoarding, and they're often, I wish I could have filmed it next to a film hoarding that would have showed Indian movie stars. But, James Gosling was and is a superstar of technology. When he left Oracle, people, there were press articles and so on about, oh, what's Gosling going to do next? As it happens, he's gone to a company called Liquid Robotics that makes seagoing robots. So people like that, when, people like you get out there, make yourself well known, even if it's in a small niche, and you bring that glory with you as you go on to your next projects. The media will write about you, people will wonder, more importantly, your peers will be watching to see, okay, well, what project is that person going to be involved in next? Because I might want to follow them too. I was, when I left Oracle after the Sun acquisition, I went to a cloud computing company called Joyent. I was hired in by Jason Hoffman, who was one of the founders and the CTO. Jason left Joyent last September to go and head up cloud at Ericsson, the Swedish telecom. As of a month ago, I'm an Ericsson employee. just a couple of caveats. Obviously, when you start to write in public, especially about things that your company is doing, there are, the basic rule of thumb at Sun Microsystems used to be don't be stupid. Now, there's a lot of nuance to don't be stupid, and the best repository of that I've found is the old Sun blogging guidelines, which you can find at that URL. It's basic stuff like, don't disclose financial information or anything that could affect markets. Don't disclose anything that's under an NDA. Don't talk disparagingly about the product or the company in the sense of, don't go saying X sucks, because sooner or later some sales guy is going to have to go and try to sell that. So at least say, well, there may be technical problems with X such that blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I would recommend highly going and grabbing that PDF and reading it. Another one that people often don't think about in this, I've talked about how you're going to have your own blog, you're going to go out there, establish your own reputation, and your reputation is what you take with you. Your actual content may also be something you want or need to take with you. I have found employer contracts all over the map on this. With Sun, for example, Sun encouraged its employees to blog, supplied the platform on which they blog, but explicitly said, you own the copyright in this content, you can do whatever you like with it. And so those of us, when we left Sun, often took our blogs with us. More recently, the company I worked for had one of those third-party HR firms that had a very draconian policy, which basically said, anything you publish during this time that you work for this company, we own. And I was trying to get the company to say, hey, wait a minute, I've had a personal blog that long predates my employment with this company. And I don't feel comfortable with you asserting that you might own that. My new employer is not that draconian, so I'm okay to let that go. But it is something you should think about, especially if you do have technical content that you put into your blog that represents a body of intellectual work. When you sign a new employment contract, make sure you have in a list of exclusions. Any blog you may already have, anything you're thinking about writing in future. It's like if you think, I'm going to write a book about JavaScript, put that in your exclusions and have the company lawyer sign off on it so that when you write it, you will own it and not the company. So a few things you can do right now. If you don't already have a public presence, I suggest you go out and get one. That doesn't mean you need to start blogging every day, but start thinking about what you can do. As I said, have a look at tech content you may have already created. Maybe your company already has a blog or multiple blogs and you can start contributing to that. If they don't, maybe you should be encouraging them to do so. Many companies will have this knee-jerk reaction of we have to control the message, and traditional marketers get very, very nervous. They don't want the devs out there peeing in the pool. So you may have to push back against these kinds of attitudes and start explaining to them why you being out there talking is a good idea. I did a version of this talk last year at Monktoberfest, which was aimed more at marketing departments. So if you want to, you can always go show them that video in which I explain to them gently why trying to restrain people from communicating is a bad idea. And as I said, go out and get started on your public speaking career because it's good for you and your career and your company in so many ways. So thank you all. Here's where you can find me. And I think we've got about 2 minutes for questions.
Do you have any advice? So, I work for a company and I don't really know. I remember specifying a couple of things when I started working there as far as the employee contract, but if I wanted to start a blog now, if I'm communicating to a company, or if I start something now, do I go back and revise my contract, or what would I do?
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to your manager and go through whatever legal process. Usually it should not be a problem, but again, just make sure you're protecting yourself.
How would you speak for the fact that you brought up documentation several times during the talk, but it's been my experience, maybe that's peculiar to the fact that I'm a developer, but a lot of managers seem hostile for documentation either because they think that their process allows them to get away with writing their code of it in case of that, or because they're just looking at it as a cost center and giving it a dirty look. So from your perspective, how best to push back against that?
Well, I started out my career doing documentation, and I was very, very good at it. And I feel like the art of documentation has been lost. It's just not. Yeah. Well, one thing I would do is turn around the question. And for example, if you're going out looking for an open source tool to use for a particular project, part of what you should be looking for is how easy is this to use? How much of it do I have to figure out on my own? And how much of it is documented? Are there code snippets, tutorials, and so on? Unfortunately, a lot of the time, you're going to end up going to Stack Overflow and asking questions, which is not ideal from the company point of view. Partly, one argument you could try is that when we have, if somebody goes to Stack Overflow and asks the question, gets it answered, all that traffic is going to Stack Overflow. Whereas if that answer is found on our own site, then they're coming to our site, and we have more chances to market to them. It's like, you can have somebody reading a very useful tutorial on how to do X with my product, and over here they've got a sign up for a free trial button. No, it wasn't a silly question at all. This is something I've been warning for years, is that tech companies have forgotten that documentation matters. And I think that's a huge, huge mistake. Anyone else? All right. Thank you all very much.